Hello, Graham from Aaron Games here, and today I've got something really special for you. I'm speaking to the amazing Rhianna Pratchett about the new fighting fantasy book, Crystal of Storms. Got my copy here that I've been reading through yesterday, today, and a lot of last week. And this book is available all good bookshops, and I believe there's even a special place you can get some extra dice from, and so on. And I'll put links to that in the video chat. So firstly, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. It's a huge pleasure. It's you know, talking to authors of the fighting fantasy books is great anyway, but especially yourself.
Oh, so, well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I'll get going with the questions. So obviously your experience is with digital games. That's what you do. You work on computer games. So why did you want to sort of almost take a step back and work on a paper book instead?
Well, actually I work on a lot of other things apart from games, although I'm probably most known for games. So I actually started out as a journalist and then went into games development and then went into comics and then went into sort of short stories, non-fiction, TV and film. So I've probably done everything else bar novels. So it was one that I basically deliberately skated around for many years because of what my father did.
Of course.
And I'd sort of established myself in games. I thought it seemed like a great challenge. Like, it was slightly scary. I wasn't sure if I could do it. So I thought, okay, you know, I'm going to embrace that challenge. That's clearly what I need to do if it scares me a little bit.
So do you think you found it easier because you're used to writing games than, you know, in a way, writing a novel is tricky because you've got to, or even a short story, because you've got characterization and you've got to follow that one plot, whereas this is a game, albeit in a written format. Do you think your experience helped with that?
Yeah, definitely. Although I work in narrative and narrative design, I picked up quite a lot about level design and general game design along the way. So I think that really helped coming up with the world building and the structure of the world and the levels as well.
Excellent. Good. So I have to ask, did you read the fighting fantasy books when you were younger? Obviously, you know, I certainly am of that generation where almost every child at school, you would go out at break time and half of them would have the books. And I just wondered if it was something you also did.
I don't remember kids of my age reading them, although I'm sure they did. But I read them when I was about 8, and I sort of rented them from my local library. And I think you may have heard the story that I told about how the library sent me, my abiding memory of fighting fantasy is the library sending me we're going to take you to court unless you return your fighting fantasy book.
Well,
which I think was Death Trap Dungeon, which was a little harsh when you're 8 years old.
Yes.
But yeah, I really enjoyed them when I was a kid. And so I had fond memories of them from that time.
Well, I mean, I still can now pick up, say, Warlock Firetop Mountain or Forest of Doom, and I can still be taken back to when I was sort of 8 or 9 and sitting, you know, on the floor on a Saturday morning reading them. So I think that the nostalgia element, but obviously they are still relevant today. And I have 4 children, and the 3 that are old enough to read all love them, which is, you know, fantastic.
That's good.
So obviously I've written quite a few books for advanced fighting fantasy set on Titan, and I've set them in various parts of the fighting fantasy world. And I just wondered why you picked the middle of the ocean of Tempest. Were you told that this is where you should set it, or were you told?
No, not at all. So I had a meeting with Steve, Ian, and John Green. And I pitched them the idea of the floating archipelago, or at least the idea of a floating island. I can't remember if I initially pitched it as an archipelago or just a single island, because I'd been influenced by the little scene in Charlie's Gates of Death with the goblins and the flying beer. And I'd seen a news story, which I think does the round every few years, about a flying island seen in the clouds over China. And it just sort of like entered my head, and I worked on BioShock Infinite in the past, and so flying islands are sort of, you know, it's just part of the narrative gumbo in my head. And so I wanted to do something with that, and I wanted to kind of expand the goblins, the technology that they were using to make the beer fly, and sort of extrapolate that to an entire world. And I think it was actually John who said, well, why don't you put it over the, because it needed somewhere to float above.
Yeah.
So he said, why don't you put it in over the Sea of Tempests? And I think I sort of came up with the idea of it's in the middle of the biggest tempest, and with the Stormborns harvesting storm crystals from the tempest. But no, they didn't say you have to do it in any place. I just came up with that idea, and John was like, oh, we could set it here. And then, because I wanted to do, I was also interested in doing something aquatic as well.
Yeah.
So I think it all sort of merged together.
Well, there's only really a couple of the long history of game books that are anything to do with sort of water. There's a pirate one, and
Demons of the Deep, I think.
So there's plenty of opportunity, and obviously you look at the map of it, and there are lots and lots of places that have never been detailed beyond an odd mention and so on, and there is a lot of opportunity for future books, right across the world, which is good. So I also have to ask, there's some very interesting creatures in the book. I was particularly taken early on with the Grapes of Wrath attacking me, which gave me quite a laugh. And I think that also ties into the humour of some of the earlier game books. So in City of Thieves, you've got the bays that play a game with a bat and a ball, and you've got the wheelies and things like that. But what's your favourite creature that you put in your book?
I don't know if I have a favourite. I like the great white squark. Well, you may not have come to that yet. That's a shark squid cross.
Yeah.
I like the sentient dragon fruit tree as well, because I like Maud, who's sort of in battle with it when you meet it.
With the shovel.
With the shovel, and so I really used a combination of my own monsters and. Thanks to you, I got a copy of Out of the Pit. So I sort of went through there quite thoroughly and sort of picked monsters that maybe hadn't been used for a while or were quite suited to the kind of location. Things like the Sharkkin and the wheelies. The wheelies had not been used for a while, and they're kind of bizarre, and I wanted to get them in somewhere as well. So I don't know if I have a favourite. But yeah, they're all my monstrous children.
Because it's interesting, because we've put out 3 books of monsters through Arion Games. So there's also Beyond the Pit and Return to the Pit. And Andrew Wright, who writes these, he says he's got enough for about another 2 books.
Right.
And we've got 250 per book. And so, every author in the series has come along. They've put their own stamp on it with their own type of creatures. And obviously yours will get added to a future edition of that to come out at some point,
exciting, actually,
some years down the line. And it is interesting, actually. You can almost read a particular monster, and for those people who really know the game books, and there are some real hardcore fans out there, they can almost identify the monsters from the picture or from the brief description, the author who originated them. So do you think it's easier writing one of these or doing the narrative writing for a computer game?
I think maybe the book is easier because you know how much you have to do. Like it's around 400 sections, and you kind of have to work out. I went majorly over my initial word count, but there's a structure to it with games, and it obviously depends on the kind of game you're working on. But with something like Tomb Raider, you'll have a core script, a cinematic script. That's what most players will experience. Then you'll have a lot of level dialogue, you'll have barks, you'll have secondary narrative that's like notes and diary entries, graffiti, stuff you can discover in the world. And so the scripts for games end up being huge, like 2 or 3 times the length of a movie, and multiple scripts as well, dealing with different areas of narrative. So I'd say that the game book was probably a little bit easier than the game.
Okay. Is it also possibly easier because it's just you writing it, whereas with the game you've got inputs from the graphic designers and from the the dialogue writers and so on? Yeah,
I mean, certainly with the big AAA games, you have hundreds of people to deal with, and in different disciplines, and they've all got their own kind of battles to fight, their own objectives, which might not align very well with narrative, like what gameplay wants to do to create an interesting gaming experience. The player might not be what narrative wants to do for the characters involved. And so there's a lot of battles that happen. There's a lot of people giving you feedback, because everyone wants to give feedback and writing, because everyone thinks they're a writer, and you're usually quite low down the power structure as a writer. So unless you're a creative director or a game director, you don't have any hard power, so you're constantly having to take on board feedback and kind of roll it into what you're doing and listen to feedback from all different areas. So it's quite, you end up having to be quite robust as a writer and quite flexible. It is nice, and I found this with comics and with developing for film and TV, that it's nice to just be on your own with the text. And I kind of felt I had John Green holding my hand as well, which was good, because he was sort of my fighting fantasy editor. So he wasn't sort of there to say, oh, don't put this monster in, or kind of about the tone or anything like that, unless I went wildly off. But he was more like the nitty gritty of fighting fantasy. So don't use the word sandwich, it's too modern. Uppercase gold pieces, but lowercase names of swords. And so it was all like how it's sort of set out on the page as well. He helped me out with battles, and I sort of went through some of his previous work as well, sort of look at, because he does his battles very intricately, multi-layered and things like that. And it was, I found that sort of quite hard to get to grips with, but he sort of helped me out with structuring that and with some ideas. So I sort of felt I wasn't like completely on my own, and that it was so useful having John there to kind of just keep me on the right track.
Well, he knows his, he really does know his stuff. So he's a great help. So for my last question, so you mentioned recently on Twitter that you've never played through D&D. You got a lot of incredulity from that. A lot of response, people saying, really? And I did read somewhere that your father used to play D&D, and in fact, one story I read was that the luggage was invented as a reward for some players rather than the standard magic sword. Is there any truth in that?
There's probably a little bit of truth, but I don't remember him playing D&D. That's not to say he didn't play it, but I imagine my dad probably played some games of D&D, but it wasn't something he carried forward to teach me about. So by the time I came along, he was into video games and computers and electronics and things like that. So I think he may have had some, I seem to remember in his library he may have had some like D&D companion books. It was not something he talked about. But the luggage actually came, his origin story for the luggage was working at the Bath Chronicle and looking out the window one day and seeing a lady walking along with a wheelie case that had lots of little wheels on, and it was going over the cobbles in Bath. As you know, Bath is very cobbly, and it was just the way the wheels were bouncing that made it look like they were little feet. Right. So I don't think it was linked to D&D.
One of those urban myths.
Maybe it was used as a prize as part of that. But I don't know whether the mimic. I think the mimic was, I was looking it up, I think that was maybe 5th edition. So I think the mimic, I think the luggage predates the mimic coming up in D&D. But no, I don't think, he played a little, I'm sure, but yeah, as I said, he kind of moved on. So my experience with D&D was quite light. I think I talked about on Twitter about Sorcerer's Cave, which I think Ian has sort of said is kind of very light D&D. I went and looked at the Wikipedia page, and there was a quote from Ian about it being very light D&D, but it is kind of D&D. But
yeah, I have a copy downstairs in my games room, so
it was really fun because you could kind of spread it out everywhere. And I played it with a little girl next door, and we used to make up monsters based on other kids we did like very much. Yeah, that was kind of really good fun. And I also played like the Baldur's Gate games, so I experienced D&D in Baldur's Gate, in Planescape Torment and things like that, but I never sort of sat down with a DM and got involved in that. But
Well,
I have friends that do it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, because obviously there's a lot of crossover between computer games. You've got the Baldur's Gate, although a new one came out, and I was rather taken aback at the enormous price of it for a pre-game. And obviously, there was a lot of D&D based games and things like Planescape Torment. Even, was a huge hit based on D&D. Yeah. And so there is a lot of crossover, and I would imagine, a lot of the levels that you achieve in games are based upon tabletop games and so on. So is it something that is a tabletop game sort of a big part of the computer games industry? Do people tend to play them a lot, or is there not really the crossover there?
I think they've sort of come back into fashion more in the last few years in particular, but I think a lot of gamers, a lot of developers have played D&D in their youth, particularly if they're interested in narrative. So that is quite popular. Developers who are a similar age to me, I think it's usually a part of their childhood. But it's coming back more into fashion. I think in the last 5 years, I've seen sort of friends starting up groups and stuff like that. So there are ones that I could join if I feel like it. Yeah. But it sounds a lot like my day job. It would just be like,
that's the thing, you see, I find, because that's one of my businesses. So I write the games. So when I'm playing them, it is my day job. But, and that's quite nice in a way, because I can sit down and play a game and know that I'm working and having fun, which of course is always good. But I mean, obviously, if you ever do, I'll quite happily send you a copy of Advanced Fighting Fantasy. You're an expert in the system already, so you've got that there. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. I will, as I said, I will put links to the book. It is a cracking read. It's definitely going to go down as one of the classics. There are one or two in the series that people say, yes, it's a game book, it's a fighting fantasy book, but that is certainly not one of them. It will go down as a classic.
I take that as a big compliment.
And if it does that well, knowing Steve and Ian, they'll be ringing you up constantly, asking you to write another one. So hopefully we'll see more from you. But thank you very much for talking to me, and have a good day.
Thank you. You too. Take care. Bye.